Okay, so we're going to get started on this panel here on encrypting to protect the future. One of the issues that was brought up this morning was the importance of encryption to protecting the future. And no panel better suits this than the team that you have assembled before you. A bunch of different fantastic scholars and practitioners on different issue areas here. And I will hand it over to Ms. Kim Zetter for leading the panel.
Thank you. So, sorry, I probably shouldn't have brought up all this stuff here. I didn't know where to put it. So I want to start just by introducing the panelists. I know that the last panel didn't do that, but I do want you to know sort of their expertise in this area. And I'll start with the, on the far left, with Trey Hare. It's, whoops, give me 1 second here. So Trey is a postdoctoral fellow with the Belfer Center's Cybersecurity Project at the Harvard Kennedy School. His work focuses on trends in nation-state developed malware, the structure of criminal marketplaces that sell malware components, and the general proliferation of malware. He's also a non-resident fellow in the Cybersecurity Initiative at the nonpartisan think tank New America. And he previously worked with the Department of Defense to develop a risk assessment methodology for information security threats. Next to Trey is Sarah McCune. Sarah is a senior researcher with Citizen Lab at the University of Toronto's Munk School of Global Affairs, where she has contributed to reports on the proliferation of the FinFisher suite of surveillance tools, privacy and security issues in China's Baidu browser, and the use of the Canadian software NetSweeper by Bahraini ISPs to censor content. Prior to joining Citizen Lab, she was law officer and special assistant to the executive director at the non-governmental organization Human Rights in China, where she focused much of her efforts on the counterterrorism policies and human rights impact of the Shanghai Cooperation Organization. Next to Sarah is Heather West, who works on public policy in the areas of security, cybersecurity, data governance, and privacy for Mozilla, the maker of the Firefox web browser. Her work there involves in part translating policy into tech and developing long-term internet strategy. She also helped found the public policy team at Cloudflare, the website performance and security company. She served as a privacy and security issues expert on Google's public policy team. And prior to all of this, she began her career working on privacy and identity management issues for the Center for Democracy and Technology. And next to me is Matt Green, who's a noted cryptographer and professor of computer science at Johns Hopkins University. His research expertise is in the area of applied cryptography. His work has focused on building and analyzing digital security systems, which sometimes involves reverse engineering existing systems to uncover flaws. In 2005, his research team found serious flaws in the anti-theft systems used in millions of Ford, Toyota, and Nissan vehicles. Last year, he and colleagues found vulnerabilities in the encryption that powers about 1/3 of the world's websites, including Facebook and the NSA's own website. This year, he and his students identified flaws in Apple's iMessage text messaging system that could have allowed an eavesdropper to intercept communications. So I want to start with the issue that really has brought us all here and became the issue that brought encryption to the attention of the general public. For anyone who's been at this for a while, this is not our first rodeo on encryption. Of course, the Clipper chip issues back in the 90s brought this up more prominently at the time, and we thought we had resolved the issue of backdoors then, and of course now it's coming back again. So I wanted to start with a question. Well, maybe we should start sort of with before we get into the Apple FBI, maybe with an overview. Maybe Sarah and Heather can help us with this. As kind of provide us with a brief overview of why encryption is so important for consumers, businesses, and other parties that we might not think of. It's clearly important for governments as well for reasons you might not even imagine. It's not just about protecting communications and national security secrets. So maybe give us, first of all, kind of an overview of the significant need for society.
Yeah, sure, I can take a stab at that. Citizen Lab has done quite a bit of research on the digital threats facing civil society and the availability of encryption has been a very important component for civil society to be able to protect themselves. Because we've seen over the past years, the digital threats that civil society is facing have only been increasing and becoming more and more sophisticated. And we've released reports such as our report on the Great Cannon, which was an offensive cyber attack linked to the Chinese state, which actually launched DDoS attacks against GitHub and an organization known as Great Fire, but it relied on encrypted traffic. We've seen the use of network injection in various commercial spyware suites. One of the spyware vendors' hacking team actually sought a patent for a network injection process. And so these techniques that are being used to exploit and target civil society actors for political reasons often require the absence of encryption to actually work. And civil society faces a number of threats, yet it has very few resources to address them, and it's facing very sophisticated threat actors. And so the availability of tools such as encryption and other digital security tools is absolutely essential to these civil society groups. And I think a lot of times you hear about the encryption debate talked about sort of in terms of, well, it's kind of the principle. It's the privacy and civil liberties principle. But for civil society groups, it's really, it's about the reality of the threats that they're facing every day. And without having access to encryption, they are significantly vulnerable.
Yeah. I think that's one of those really important examples of a particularly, I don't want to say vulnerable, but folks that take advantage of encryption in ways above and beyond the way a typical user might. At Firefox, we've spent quite a long time, almost 20 years now, thinking about how to make the web better for everyone. We want to protect the human rights workers, but we also want to protect your Amazon purchases, and we also want to protect, your Facebook musings, or whatever else you choose to do on the internet. And so we have taken on encryption as an issue to think about how to make the web a safer place for everyone, and also how to enable the tools for the folks that particularly need them. I think it's important to step back a little bit and talk about exactly what encryption does. I think there's a huge amount of discussion right now about, device encryption. Can I get into this iPhone? And also about kind of point-to-point communication encryption. Can we keep that confidential? But encryption also enables things like authenticated communication. And so if I want to say something to Matt, I can use encryption to prove it's me. And instead of someone spoofing my communication, it also ensures that whatever I say gets to Matt. I think that there's there's a bunch of aspects around encryption that we think are incredibly important for users. It's actually a part of our the quote unquote Mozilla manifesto, kind of the mission that we work towards, both in a technical and non-technical methods. Is privacy and security on the internet are not optional. They're not things that we can kind of look at and say, maybe this is important, maybe we'll do something else. I think that one of the things that gets overlooked in the encryption debate is exactly how broadly used encryption is. It is a thing that we have mandated most of our highly regulated industries to use because it is an important way to protect information. And it's also, when you step back and think about it, it's the only thing that has made the commercial web possible. I'm not going to go to Amazon if I have to transmit my credit card in the clear. And so it's a huge it's part of the foundation of trust that makes the internet, a healthy ecosystem and useful for I think anyone.
So there's an aspect that that Trey had mentioned in a previous conversation that we had that doesn't come up quite often in the encryption debate. A lot of malware is encrypted, and it's encrypted for purposes of preventing easy detection by antivirus tools and also analysis, reverse engineering by researchers. And there's a flip side to that. For malicious actors using encryption, isn't the only side of that. Why don't you talk about the
Right. No,
the
thank you,
need?
Kim. I mean, one of the things that's interesting, so we usually talk about encryption in the context of protecting a user's data, right? And Heather does a nice job in pointing out that it also has to do in protecting the integrity of data and the authentication process of these communications. But user data, right, is not necessarily always the thing being attacked. It could very well be, it could be the tool doing the attacking. So one of the potential areas of improvement that we're seeing in the sort of conflict domain with encryption is the use of sophisticated algorithms to protect offensive tools, right, from inspection and potential reuse by opponents. That sort of reuse limits our ability to select targets and employ the full range of our tool set at will. A sophisticated opponent is going to be able to record, forensically analyze, and at least take apart, if not reuse, select components of that tool set that we've used against them. So weighing that cost-benefit process becomes a significant imposition, right, on the operational unit or on the strategic commander that has to make that decision. Cryptography offers us the opportunity to potentially limit the likelihood of forensic analysis and reuse, right? So there is a tool set that has been discussed in the open literature, regardless of who it's attributed to, called Gauss. Part of Gauss's payload depends on what are called context-specific keys. So specific elements of a computer, configuration files, particular file architecture, distinct files actually present on the computer, cats.doc, as part of the encryption key which enables it to operate. Without those files or without knowledge of what that configuration looks like, the payload's unopenable, right? It can't be used against us. So I think, I mean, we talk about the sort of government private sector, debate in terms of security versus privacy or security versus security. There are some very clear applications for cryptography in the government space to secure our own tools against inspection and reuse.
Yeah, so we saw that if you contrast Gauss with Stuxnet. I mean, Stuxnet had its encryption keys embedded in the malware itself. Sorry, in the offensive tool / malware. And because the decryption keys were actually in the code itself, that allowed Symantec and other researchers to reverse engineer it, take it apart, figure out what the actual payload was doing. By contrast, Gauss, which we believe was created by some of the same team that created Stuxnet, they were much smarter, and they did not put the decryption key in the malware itself. In order to decrypt it, it's based on very specific information that's in the configuration of the target system. So you need to know exactly what on that target system is part of the key, and then only the victim would be able to decrypt that attack tool. And so, as you point out, it can't be reused in the way that Stuxnet could be reused or reconfigured or retweaked or whatever, and also can't be analyzed. So we wouldn't have known about Stuxnet if Stuxnet was more secure. But there were limitations to that. There are reasons why you don't want to put the key, why you do want to put the key in the malware, because if the configuration on your target system changes, then your malware is not going to work, decrypt itself. Let's look at the tools. I want to. You sort of mentioned about mobile phones and sort of the desktop systems that are being attacked and things that are the focus. Can you just sort of give us an overview of what is the level of use of encryption at this point? I mean, we know that. I mean, encryption has been around publicly for mass use, at least since PGP. We're talking, 1990s. And yet it hasn't been largely adopted. The Snowden leaks obviously made it much more of an immediate use. But is it really being adopted? Do we know the level that people are actually opting for chat tools that are encrypted, that have end-to-end encryption, as opposed to maybe server-side encryption, and tools that maybe have not encryption by default? Are people actually turning on encryption?
I think,
what do we know?
I mean, encryption is actually, it's a hard thing to quantify because I do think it's present in a huge number of growing products and at all levels of the kind of technical stack. I can encrypt my tablet so that if I leave it somewhere, great, that's very surface level. There was a big uproar, for example, of all things, Hello Barbie wasn't encrypted. And people were looking at that and saying, you're sending my kid's voice to this server unencrypted? Wow, I'm suddenly incredibly uncomfortable with this. One of the mileposts that we reached, I think last week maybe, maybe this week, is that half of the connections Firefox makes with websites are encrypted. That's a new milestone. You know, a project that we're involved in called Let's Encrypt manages 10 million active encryption certificates for websites. So I think people are making that choice a lot more. You know, there are apps like WhatsApp that have chosen to turn encryption on for you know, two-person conversations all the time because they simply think it's the best protection for their users. You know, I think that there's a lot of other tools out there that allow you, but one of the challenges has been that kind of state-of-the-art encryption is not something that's easy to use yet. That's changing over time. I think as things like WhatsApp turn on, you know, point-to-point, end-to-end encryption, people are starting to say, wait a second, I can do that. Oh, wait a second, I think my connected car needs to have an encrypted connection to an update server so that, you know, I don't end up on the highway and someone takes it over. People are starting to realize this is important. Not only kind of, I think you mentioned defaults. If it defaults off and a user has to take an action to turn it on, it's going to, like, that's a little bit more of a burden on the user. But I think people are starting to look at this and saying, from the design phase, this is no longer optional, and this is no longer, you know, something that we can do and not suffer the consequences. I think there's actually been some regulatory, you know, action based on you should have encrypted this content, and you didn't, and now your users have been hurt. I think that you'd be very surprised how many things have encrypted connections, and I think that that's actually a really great thing. I think Matt may have some other, like, really like specific examples. I'm actually thinking through all of the devices in my home that connect to something, and I'm pretty sure they're all encrypted. Maybe not my TV, but you know, that's the kind of thing I think consumers at the technological level, when encryption is not something that you have to think about, I think we're doing it right. So I would almost reframe that a little bit. I do think consumers, especially post-Snowden, as you mentioned, are being much more thoughtful about this. I think that we need to get them over that educational hump to make sure that they understand what their options are, and so they don't feel helpless about it.
Matt, you want to jump in on that?
So I think we're moving towards a world where, you know, almost every piece of data that goes over a wire is going to be encrypted. Maybe not today, but, you know, sometime in the next... Someday soon. Mm-hmm. But the thing about that is that not all encryption is created equal. So the fact that I'm encrypting something doesn't necessarily mean that, you know, it's not going to be intercepted by somebody who's in the right position. So, for example, there's end-to-end encryption, which is, you know, what you were speaking about, where I encrypt a message and only the person I'm talking to can read that message. And then there's server-based encryption, where I'm encrypting to Google servers, and then the message isn't clear up on Google servers. And I think what we're learning is that, you know, which of those choices you make is really what's going to define how secure your data is in the future. We're also learning that servers are really hard to keep secure. And so I think, you know, we're going to make the big jump to securing the stuff going over the wire, and then find out that it's all sitting on a server somewhere, and eventually we're going to have to figure out how to encrypt that data too.
Feel free, any of you, on any of the questions to jump in when you've got something to contribute. I'm going to come back to sort of the issue of why it's hard to get crypto right and the options for crypto. But I want to just switch for a second here to the Apple FBI thing so that we can look at this going dark problem. We've got, as you point out, a lot of other products that and services that are being encrypted. And, of course, the Apple FBI case gave this going dark issue prominence, where the FBI and other authorities are saying that they can't get into devices, and they think that there should be some kind of mandated backdoor. In opposition, of course, to the intelligence community, which seems to have some abilities to get around things without a backdoor, and says they don't want backdoors because it can create insecurities in the systems. So one of the arguments of the FBI is that they don't believe academics and cryptographers that you can't do this securely. They think that somehow you're being lazy, and that if you just tried a little harder to think about this, you could actually come up with a solution that could allow law enforcement access when they legitimately need it, and at the same time still be done in a secure manner. Is there such a solution? Does it exist?
So I think it's kind of funny that the FBI is saying academics should come up with a solution. Because honestly, like, academics are the people like most likely to screw it up. You know, we can draw something on a whiteboard that looks really good and will make this whole system work, where, you know, police can get access to data, but nobody else can. But what's actually going to happen is somebody's going to send that whiteboard picture out to a company, and that company is going to implement it, and that company is going to store the keys that law enforcement is supposed to use to access it somewhere relatively insecure, and then you're going to have an Edward Snowden type of person who's going to get access to those keys, and all sorts of things that can go wrong will go wrong. But they're going to go wrong after the academics get to it. And so I think what we're saying when we say it can't be done is that, look, we have been watching for the last 20-something years how people deploy crypto. And we've seen over and over that these weakenings and these kind of subverted encryption systems get broken. In fact, we've broken like 2 in the last year. The export-grade encryption from the 1990s led to a huge set of vulnerabilities last year. So I think the point is that all of our experience tells us it's going to go wrong. And nobody can offer us any reason to believe it's going to go differently this time. And we're just asking the question, okay, the burden should be on law enforcement. If you're going to fundamentally change the way everybody operates, prove to us that it's going to be different and secure this time. And we're happy to go along and do whatever we can to support it if you know how to do it right.
I think that there is a frustration because they can describe a system that you can build. It is possible to build. It's just not a good idea. The best kind of example I can come up with is I'm also capable of building a car without brakes, but that also sounds like a bad idea.
If it was possible, let's take apart what past history shows us, and what technically speaking. Let's just say that they're right and it's possible to do some kind of backdoor with a key escrow or whatever it is solution that David Chom wants to promote, or anyone else. Let's say we do find something that's viable. What is the process around that has to happen in order to make that viable? Not just the technological solution, but the process around ensuring the integrity of how the negotiation happens, key negotiation or anything like that, without getting into sort of the nitty-gritty details of key negotiation.
So you mean, how does the key escrow work, or how do we make people use it?
I guess in sort of like policy-wise as well, but also if you want to get into some of the details of key escrow.
Sure. Okay. So
like what's the structure that needs to change in order for something like that to actually work in a secure manner?
Okay. So I mean, the easiest way to do this is to go back to the last serious proposal we had to do this right, which was Clipper back in the 1990s. And Clipper was a hardware chip that we were supposed to install in our phones and our computers that would give us all the encryption we wanted, and every bad guy would promise not to use software encryption, which seems like a hard promise to make, but they would make that promise. And what Clipper would do is it would give you access to encryption, and every time you made a connection to somebody else on the internet, it would encrypt under a government key. It would encrypt a copy of the session key that was securing that particular phone call. It would encrypt it to the government. Now, most of the time, the government wouldn't be able to read that key, or they wouldn't care. But if you were a criminal and they were trying to tap your communications, they could pull that value and they could try to decrypt it. And the way they tried to address the Edward Snowden stealing the keys problem is they actually split the government's copy of the key over 2 different agencies. And there was supposed to be a policy in place where law enforcement could go to these agencies and there would be safeguards against abuse. And it was a really, elegant kind of system, except for the fact that if anybody got that database in the 2 agencies, the whole system was broken. Every single telephone call, every piece of data in the United States and maybe eventually the world would be broken. But even worse, if there was a technical flaw in the system, things could be even less secure. And so it actually turned out that 1 year after the system was proposed, a scientist named Matt Blaze found that they had actually got some things very seriously wrong, and the whole project was scuttled. So there are 2 different ways, that things can go wrong. One is that the policies don't protect you against keeping those government keys safe, which is a very big concern. And the second is that somebody makes a mistake implementing the system. And unfortunately, we know that this happens. We saw it happen. And we just don't have the confidence that it's not going to happen again.
And part of this whole discussion that from a purely practical matter and not a technical matter at all, is that if the U.S. government says you have to build a backdoor in whatever form that ends up taking, that is the easiest way to kill the U.S. tech sector, because no one will ever buy or use their services again. You know, and I think that would be a very serious problem. I think one of the things about the Clipper chip is that you had to voluntarily use it, and some sort of mandate would be, you know, as I, you know, talking about how encryption creates trust on the internet. It would be the easiest, quickest way to kill that trust and actually move all of that expertise abroad.
Yeah, and unless you think this stuff is hard. I mean, I have 70 students in my class right now. My homework assignment that they turned in last week was write an end-to-end encrypted instant messaging app. And they did it, and they all did it, even the ones who are, you know, not as strong at programming. It's not hard. The tools are out there. You can't put them back in the bottle. So you ban this stuff, somebody else will sell it overseas.
Yeah.
I think it's also important to note that these debates aren't happening in a legal vacuum. There is a legal framework addressing what kinds of assistance should be expected of companies when it comes to facilitating law enforcement investigations. In the U.S., that's provided by the Communications Assistance for Law Enforcement Act. And under that act, as it is currently on the books, information service companies like Apple are not required under the law to actually work for or provide specific assistance to law enforcement that would require them to create or redesign one of their products. And in the court case concerning Apple that was brought in New York by the FBI, the judge in that case, Judge Orenstein, actually his opinion was that the All Writs Act did not compel Apple to provide assistance to the FBI, because CALEA had specifically envisioned this, and as a matter of congressional intent, an information service company like Apple should not have to do that. So I think we need to assess that framework as well. You know, if there is a move towards creating new laws, I think that needs to be very public and transparent and subject to, you know, rigorous debate. But I think it would be disingenuous to act like you know, this push and pull is happening, you know, without some kind of frame of reference provided by law.
And I do think that the New York case, sorry, this is going to be a slight tangent, demonstrates an important piece of this, like this discussion. Law enforcement, everyone has a lot of tools at their disposal. You know, decrypting content is one of them. In the New York case, they actually dropped it because they asked the suspect's spouse what their password was. And they figured it out. They came up with a couple possibilities. They unlocked the phone, and we're done.
So I want to address that issue of other ways, other means, because one of the things that came up in the Apple FBI dispute was that there were many people who believed that there were other methods out there, possibly known by the NSA, and that just weren't being shared with the FBI. So when the FBI ultimately dropped its case, it was because, in fact, they did find another means of getting into the phone. A third party came forward and said that they'd found a vulnerability in the Apple system, a zero-day vulnerability, and it allows the government to do, the FBI to do a brute force password crack in the way that Apple would have had to do, or not in the same way, but achieve the same effect. Now, that vulnerability is not going to be disclosed. The government has signed a non-disclosure agreement with whoever they purchase this from, and they, in fact, don't even know what the vulnerability is. It's not the government cracking the phone. They're basically handing it off to this third party, and the third party is getting into the phone. This quite often happens with mobile forensics. Mobile forensics companies sometimes include the 0 days in their automated tools so that law enforcement can get into the phone automatically. But when it's a very sensitive 0 day that they don't want exposed, that they either don't want the vendor to reverse engineer the tool and find the vulnerability and patch it, or they don't want competitors to find out what that vulnerability is, then they will have sort of a mail-in process or delivery process where law enforcement will actually have to bring the phone into them, and then only the mobile forensic company will perform that action. So this It's very interesting that in the recent leaked emails from Hillary Clinton, her staff is talking about this trade-off between backdoors and hacking, targeted hacking. If you're going to find vulnerabilities or you're going to have backdoors. And they talk about, they want to emphasize to the tech community that they prefer that finding the vulnerabilities, finding that hacking method rather than the backdoor method. So this, of course, has been expressed by some parts of the civil liberties community as a more preferable way of getting into systems, either real time when someone still owns the phone or after the fact. But this raises new issues for us now. If we're going to condone the use of 0 days and finding vulnerabilities in systems, then we have this problem of non-disclosure of vulnerabilities that the government knows about, maybe sharing with other governments, and the general public and the creators of the systems don't know about it and can't be patched. So are we trading one problem, one security problem for another?
Go ahead.
Well, I don't know that I would necessarily phrase it as trading, because this industry is growing by leaps and bounds regardless of what's happening with law enforcement. I mean, it's being used by governments around the world to spy on, not only criminals and terrorists, but also political activists, change agents. So this is happening, and it's very real. I think I think what's important to consider is that strong encryption protects at scale, whereas targeted intrusion is tied to a specifically identified individual. And so I think in that sense, it is preferable to have the use of a targeted attack if it's lawfully authorized. But in terms of what's best for the public at large, I think having the availability of encryption on communication platforms is definitely essential.
So you're less concerned about the problem that you leave millions of systems vulnerable to not just attack by that law enforcement, but potentially to anyone else who can find that vulnerability as well. You're less concerned about that than the backdoor that would just automatically make everyone more vulnerable.
Well, I think they're both concerning. Don't get me wrong about that. But I think in terms of the technique that is utilized by law enforcement, I think it would be a mistake to weaken encryption because, you're going to have vulnerabilities and the use of vulnerabilities regardless.
It does trade off. It's not exactly a trade so much as there's a broader set of issues involved in what folks are calling lawful hacking. And I think that phrase is actually really important. When you're going for that individual intrusion, you should also be going through a particular process to make sure that it is lawful and reasonable and necessary. And then the when you have all of that system in place, very similar to some of the other surveillance regimes that governments put in place with checks and balances. Then the government should also remember that it has a responsibility to help bolster cybersecurity for everyone, not only get into that one iPhone, but I do think that the responsible thing to do is to then go through the best practices of coordinated disclosure to really help patch that bug. There are plenty of bugs. Like we're never going to write perfect software. We're going to be able to get in. That's my opinion on this. And if the trade-off is that we have to be okay with some targeted lawful hacking, I think that's a reasonable balance.
And I think what's also important to consider is that we really need to move the conversation forward as we discuss encryption, but we need to also move the conversation forward about what the appropriate oversight and accountability should be for use of vulnerabilities. Because right now, the market that's supplying many of the exploits that utilize these vulnerabilities is almost entirely unregulated. The transparency is basically non-existent, and there's no discussion about how we actually create the structures to allow the public and concerned parties to hold these entities accountable and to actually inquire about what's being done and what the capabilities even are.
There's an entire panel tomorrow for anyone who's interested on the vulnerabilities equities process, which is the process the federal government uses to determine whether or not they should withhold a vulnerability, a zero-day that they've discovered or that they've purchased, whether they should withhold that information from the vendor to prevent it from being patched so that they can continue to exploit it, or if it's a vulnerability that they should actually disclose. Do one of you want to just sort of give a brief overview of what that VEP process involves?
Sure. The VEP, Vulnerabilities Equities Process, is a process that was put together in 2010. It was implemented in 2014. There were some disclosure processes that predate it, specifically housed at the NSA. But the VEP is designed to be kind of an interagency discussion about whether a particular vulnerability ought to be withheld from the vendor because there's some operational use or some compelling reason not to give it to the vendor to then get fixed. I think that there's I think it's actually a pretty reasonable process, but not everyone goes through it. Not everyone. It is currently voluntary. I think actually that the intelligence and defense side probably use it in a more rigorous way than a lot of others. I think the FBI has come up with some clever ways to avoid it. They were asked whether or not they put vulnerabilities through the VEP process in a hearing a couple of weeks ago, maybe a month ago, and Director Comey actually said, yeah, we choose not to. And so I think that's the interagency process, balancing these equities is an important part of the discussion. If you're going to be acquiring and using vulnerabilities, when do you disclose, how do you disclose, and how do you do that in a way that really boosts the ecosystem instead of making everyone wonder, well, is there a bug in my encryption? Has it been there for years? Did you know about it?
Oh, right, and sorry.
Yeah, I think there's three kind of just thoughts that jump out thinking, the first is, the lawful hacking idea embodies an adversarial relationship between the state and us and companies, right? So it does two things that are a little strange. The first is it embodies a tension, right? So we're not trying to come necessarily to an equitable arrangement, but rather we're agreeing that we're going to pit two sides against each other. The second, though, is it perhaps artificially condenses these companies and these individuals. So one of the things I think is interesting about the Apple case is in this instance, the interest of the company was to protect the privacy of its users. But that has rarely been the case, I think, generally, when we look at the evolution of the internet and some of these service companies where we are the monetized product, right? The use of Facebook and Google and Yahoo and these other services is premised on the fact that our information has value to be sold, resold, and reused by others. So I don't know that it's interesting to say that we're going to now allow for law to make this tension permanent and to artificially push these two groups together. So that's just on the adversarial process. Regard the VEP, it is fascinating to see the diversity of opinions that people have on the very limited information that's been released. The default to disclosure, which is the sort of traditional line that's been articulated in the highly detailed blog post, which is the primary government document related to this process that's been released officially.
The only public document.
The default to disclosure is a valuable piece of information, right? It gives us a statistic about how many vulnerabilities this process discloses, but there's two kind of important caveats to that. The first is we don't know what sorts of vulnerabilities are being disclosed. And when we're talking about cryptography in this particular panel, there are libraries and there are particular pieces of software that are depended on by vast numbers of other pieces of software in which a vulnerability would be substantially more valuable and substantially more threatening to the general welfare than in a single chat application. So we had this discussion about Heartbleed, and it pops up, right? OpenSSL, right, is an open source library that implements the secure socket layer, this encrypted tunnel that Heather's company has now gotten 50% of users to be using, right, in connecting to the web. OpenSSL is a substantial point of vulnerability in the internet security ecosystem. So a vulnerability there is a much bigger problem than just a single vulnerability in Telegram, right, or Signal or WhatsApp. So the extent to which this VEP process is enabling the targeted discovery and non-disclosure of vulnerabilities in these sorts of systems and libraries is a substantial and as yet not well-discussed public policy issue. So that we're embedding in this process the idea that it may be okay for the intelligence community and law enforcement to be targeting these sorts of critical dependencies is, I think, a question that we need to grapple with. Just one other quick point. Where we regulate is really critical. and lawful hacking, right, and the now famous key is under doormats paper, right, the idea that we're going to embed this adversarial process is a fascinating idea, and I think it's probably a very valuable one. But it changes where oversight has most power. So in some ways, although it's a technically suboptimal and from a security standpoint terrible solution, negotiated backdoors allows for very formal oversight-driven processes to embed in security, right? It's crap because it reduces the security of everybody else, right? It creates another opportunity for attackers, but provides multiple avenues for oversight. A potential downside with the lawful hacking space is then we have to go and try to build regulations and oversight mechanisms to govern how the intelligence community and the law enforcement community are acting in this, I would say highly unregulated is probably an understatement, market for software vulnerabilities and malicious software, right? It's an area that we are probably a decade away from really grappling with well. So again, be conscious of our trade-offs. It's probably a good idea, but it comes with a cost of reducing the amount of oversight we want to be able to lean on it.
Don't we also sort of create a hierarchy, sort of an elitism among law enforcement as well? So in this case, everyone was pretty sure that the NSA had the ability to get into that iPhone, that San Bernardino iPhone, and wasn't sharing. When you have the FBI seemed to indicate, although they've sort of backtracked from this, Director Comey had said that the cost of this vulnerability or the solution was 3 times, I think, the amount. It was equal to the amount that he would make in the remainder of his tenure or something. Anyway, it comes out to about $1 million, $1.3 million or something. So you raise sort of this hierarchy of law enforcement that can afford this kind of ability to crack into a system and law enforcement that can't. And you've got sort of law enforcement, after the Apple FBI case after they filed the case, there was a lot of local law enforcement that said, if the FBI can get into that phone, we're right in line behind them. And now the FBI, of course, can't share that solution with other law enforcement. So
they actually did offer it to state and local.
Sorry?
They did offer to crack phones for state and local, so they have the ability to do it again.
So, but I guess I'm trying to understand, like, when you're sort of expanding that to more vulnerabilities and more elite capabilities as iPhones get even more secure, are you looking at sort of this artificial? I'm not quite sure what the right term is, but you're having this tension between law enforcement themselves. It's no longer just about intelligence level, which we sort of expect that if you've got a classified tool, you may not want to share it with law enforcement. But when you're talking about divisions within law enforcement itself, local and federal level, or even jurisdictions, they may not share, or they may not have the ability to share. So what tensions are we creating in that regard as well, when we're choosing that as our method of getting into the phones?
I mean, from my perspective, I think that hierarchy is actually legitimate. The intelligence agencies are looking at more important things than my local police department. And so we resource them differently.
Okay.
I think that may be slightly controversial, but I also think that throughout this hierarchy, there's the opportunity for education and knowledge sharing that makes folks feel like they have a better set of resources on the state and local side.
Okay. I want to get into just sort of a legislative issue, and then I want to get into the more technical issues with you, Matt, about getting crypto right. But one of the things that came up, of course, with the Apple FBI issue was a knee-jerk reaction of lawmakers. And that's obviously concerned us around a lot of technologies where Capitol Hill doesn't necessarily, not everyone, there are exceptions, but they're making policy around issues that they maybe don't understand, don't have access to the technical expertise, or simply don't know either the right questions to ask or have anyone on staff that can actually receive the answers that they get if they do ask the right questions. So I'm wondering, like, how do we educate lawmakers? How do we improve this process of policy and oversight when you sort of have this handicap among the body that's supposed to provide this oversight and laws around?
A huge amount of education. I actually go to the Hill on a reasonably regular basis to try to help, and I know that a lot of technologists are doing educational stuff. I know you have. There are staff there. We're starting to see staff who are really savvy on this stuff. There's a few of them. I can count on one hand, I think, the ones that I think are really savvy on encryption. But one of the really exceptional things about this Congress is we have 4 representatives in the House who have a cybersecurity computer science background. That's new, and that has changed the debate on this kind of thing. There was a truly wonderful rant by Representative Ted Lieu on an encryption hearing, and that was informed both by his time at a cybersecurity agency, but also as a part of the Air Force Reserve. He has also, I think he may have been in intelligence, and so he had the perfect background to kind of look at this debate and say, why are we just talking about red herrings? Why is this the discussion we are having? It is super frustrating. Let's talk about real stuff. And so having that kind of expertise voted into Congress is going to change the game significantly. I'm not particularly worried about my job security yet, unfortunately. I would much prefer that there was a level of understanding, but I think that at least now that it's an issue people are talking about, they're very open to sitting down. Generally, there are some folks whose minds are made up, but they're generally, staff and members are very interested in sitting down and saying, okay, so how does this work? How does this impact, my constituents? How does this impact the law enforcement community? And actually having that discussion in a productive way. That's going to take a lot of effort from all sides.
I think one of the other keys is trying to disambiguate a lot of these issues, which tend to get clustered together. So Heather and I have been fortunate enough to collaborate on a chapter in an upcoming book, which I'll plug here briefly.
Good plug.
Called Cyber Insecurity, right? Navigating the Perils of the Next Information Age. And what we've attempted to do, based around actually a lot of content that we received, feedback we received from briefing congressional staff, was to try and break cyber, right, the cyber, up into multiple distinct issue blocks. One of the challenges that comes up, especially in these sorts of debates, is that we tend to intermesh issues with increasing rapidity. So national security gets lopped into criminal discussions. Individual best practices, hygiene, and regulation escalates to the question of how do you defeat China, right? And this sort of co-meshing of issues isn't really practical, right? It does something that security engineers have talked about as a mortal sin from time immemorial, right? It confuses the threat model. So what we're attempting to do, I think, in the book, but also helps in terms of this congressional dialogue and education, is to focus on an actual set of problems and a distinct set of solutions that make sense within the domain of that problem. Right? Not to necessarily take something that is an intelligence community issue and apply it in a law enforcement context or farther down the chain. So at least from my perspective and having sat in some of these meetings, I think one of the most valuable things is not to necessarily expect that every rep or every senator or every member of the executive branch is going to be the world's expert on all of these things, but to acknowledge the reasonable and entirely practical cognitive limitations that exist on any number of similar issues and say your area issue is actually much smaller. The problems and solution set that you have to worry about is actually a tiny chunk of the space. And let's educate on that. Let's get knowledgeable on that.
Yeah, and I think just to add on to that, I think it's very important to sort of enumerate the needs and the use cases on the law enforcement side, because as Heather mentioned, I mean, there are very different mandates and very different levels of urgency associated with whatever case it is that you're working on. I mean, not every case is going to involve data that could potentially uncover a terrorist, and perhaps it's less urgent, perhaps it's a more general criminal case. So I think really focusing on specifically what the ask is and what is appropriate in which fact pattern, I think is something that we're going to have to do more of as well.
I do think that that's actually, I'm sorry to keep jumping in, but when CALEA, the Law Enforcement Assistance Act, was passed decades ago, I forget, 80s, the FBI actually put together a list of the things that they needed that this would enable. We haven't seen those kind of case studies in this encryption debate. I've chatted with some folks at the FBI who say they're putting that together, and I think it'll actually hopefully be really helpful as we kind of bring this discussion out of the clouds and back down to earth a little bit.
So I'm going to be opening up for questions in a few minutes, but I want to ask Matt. First, I want to ask you about sort of the issue that made it possible for Apple to actually cooperate with the FBI in this case, and then get on to sort of the harder problem of crypto in general. But many people sort of said that Apple made a mistake in putting itself in that position, that it could have gone farther with the protection that it had implemented into that phone. You want to talk about that for a minute, and what we may see as the next stage that eliminates even that ability going forward?
Sure. So from the FBI's point of view, this was about the worst possible case you could be in when it comes to trying to defeat an encryption system. You had a phone that was all locked and offline where the data on it was encrypted. And typically what that means, when you encrypt something on a device, computer or a phone, you type in a passcode, that passcode gets turned into a key, and that key is used to encrypt the data. So if you don't have the passcode, or you can't guess the passcode, then that data is, unavailable to you. No software exploit, no hacking is going to get you into that data. The NSA might have some amazing exploit against the cryptography, but probably even they don't, or else they wouldn't be using it. It's the same crypto they're using. So the one thing that people can do wrong is they can use weak passwords. And for example, most of you probably have a 4-digit or maybe even a 6-digit password on your phone. Those are not terribly strong. So what Apple did to try to strengthen their phones against people trying to run through and just guess every one of those passcodes is they used a piece of hardware inside the phone that basically was designed to lock you out after a certain number of guesses. Now, had the Farouk iPhone been encrypted with maybe a 20-digit passcode or a long passcode, there's nothing Apple could have done about this. But because it was only encrypted with a 4-digit passcode, everything came down to whether this hardware inside that phone could stop the FBI from making too many guesses, and whether the FBI could somehow override that hardware and make it not do its job. And it turns out that Apple has been gradually improving the quality of the hardware inside their phones to make it do that job better over time. Unfortunately, this phone was an iPhone 5C, which is kind of the last generation of 32-bit phones that didn't really have very strong protections against this. And also it had some bugs apparently in the kernel bootloader somewhere that allowed somebody to maybe hack into it and override things there. The later generation of phones, the newer generation of phones, has a special chip inside of it called the Secure Enclave Processor. And the idea behind this chip is all of that security functionality is now condensed into a very secure, dedicated chip. And as a result, whatever happened with the iPhone 5C is much, much less likely to happen on more recent iPhones. So Apple has made a progression. It's not their fault this phone was bad. It's just that it used older technology. So it's hard to really, it's hard to blame Apple for having the ability to, update the software on their phones. They've made strides to protect their newer phones against these kinds of attacks. So I mean that's about 65% of the issue. I could probably go on and talk about secure enclave processors all day, but I think it's bad enough that I've already talked about them as much.
So let's talk about. I don't know if there are any immediate questions at this point, but let's talk about why crypto is so hard. We've seen a lot of applications come out. We see a lot of services touting their encryption, and then we see issues arising as soon as someone actually looks at it. Telegram, for instance, has run into some problems. So obviously the implementation of encryption is really important.
Yep.
Why is this so difficult to get hard? Why is it so hard to get right?
I mean, crypto is really, really hard. I wish there was a better answer than just saying, to answer why is crypto hard. It's just because it's hard. It's really easy. The best analogy I've heard is if you're building a piece of IKEA furniture and you forget a screw, it's not going to collapse and take out your entire living room. It's probably just going to wobble a little. But with crypto, when you forget that one screw, the entire thing becomes completely unsound, and all of the messages you thought were securely encrypted turn out not to be. Something as stupid as having 3 bits of randomness that are just a little bit not random can lead to somebody stealing your entire private key. And so a lot of these things are very clever. So last year, my students and I looked at Apple's iMessage, which, I've realized recently people don't think of it as Apple iMessage. They think of it as the blue bubbles on their phone. But those encrypted messages are supposed to be end-to-end encrypted. And we found that even Apple, who are supposed to be like the best, the richest, the people who have the most resources, couldn't get their encryption right. We were actually able to decrypt messages and attachments that were encrypted that had gone through Apple's servers. And so just getting it right before you do backdoors turns out to be just really, really difficult without a lot of domain expertise. And so that's why I'm so nervous about this idea of deliberately adding backdoors, because we're barely getting encryption right as it is.
And what about usability? Because one of the reasons why encryption wasn't adopted more widely with PGP was very difficult to use and clumsy and problematic in terms of its usability. Have we improved in terms of usability, or does the usability also create trade-offs in security and the implementation?
So I'm just curious, how many people in this audience have used PGP? Okay, how many of those with your hands up enjoyed the experience?
Okay, we got one.
Okay, congratulations. No, PGP was really hard to use, but it was the only thing available. I mean, it was really hard. You had to download someone's key, install it. I mean, I just been using it for the last week, and I hated it. And it was really easy to screw it up. But now we have these awesome new encrypted messengers, things like WhatsApp, which has default end-to-end encryption. You don't even have to know that there is a key there. It's all just done for you. And so I think that's the usability. That's what's really changed, is for years, the FBI and the NSA and all of these agencies could get by on the fact that encryption was maybe a 2% problem, maybe even less. 2% of the world would use it because it was so terrible. And all of a sudden, in the blink of an eye, we have these smartphones in our pocket that are great for storing keys on, great for doing all the UI stuff that we need to do, just are perfect for doing this kind of encryption. And I think it's just taken people by surprise.
Do we have any questions from the audience? Yeah.
Amanda Draker. So with the Apple FBI case, as you said, the FBI never actually got the details of the exploit that was used. Now, in my forensics training, I was told it's very important to know the details of what your tools do, because otherwise you don't have faith in the integrity of your data. If you don't know what was used to get the data, you don't know that it's the data that you started with. So how terrifying a legal precedent is that they are using as evidence data that they don't know how it was generated?
Good point.
I think it's kind of concerning. I know less about that process than an actual court case where the FBI was using a tool that they don't want to disclose to gather evidence, and some of the defendants are making that case, and so suddenly all of the defendants are making this case because defense lawyers aren't dumb. It's going to be really interesting to see where the court precedent comes out on that. I think that when there's not a judicial standard, it's going to be a different discussion. If you trust the people with the tool, but that can also be a high bar. But I think you're right, if you don't know how the information was gathered.
But I think that that's the case with all forensic tools. I mean, you don't reverse engineer your forensic tool, right? Your automated tool that you just plug a phone into. You trust that the company that you're purchasing it from has done the troubleshooting and is hashing the data in some way, is providing some method of integrity, right? So it's not necessarily that you, would it?
To some extent, those tools are open, or they could be looked at. If you really have a strong
if you wanted
suspicion,
to, right?
That the tool is actually compromising the data, there's a way to get that answer, but there's no way to get that answer with some of
in this case. True, yeah.
I think that hits on something that's potentially a counterintuitive point that we had talked about earlier, where I think it seems like we kind of agree that it's troubling to see these more sophisticated capabilities being pushed to lower levels of law enforcement, where suddenly state police or local police have a capability that used to be, a week ago or a year ago, exclusively the intelligence community. I want to flip that on its head for a minute and argue that maybe is a very good thing. The reason being for exactly this sort of issue, where a lot of our really powerful case law around the restrictions for what law enforcement can and cannot do, especially with regarding digital devices and search and seizure, tends to come from incredibly run-of-the-mill cases that happen at lower levels. I'm thinking particularly about Riley, right? This decision around treating digital data as not having this sort of ephemeral significance, but being something that does have the same protections of Fourth Amendment search and seizure, like your person, your places, your physical objects and files. That came from an incidental search of a cell phone, of a car, right? So I think in some ways, I would love to see some state police forces, some local police forces using these sorts of tools without having any understanding, right? Similar to the binding non-disclosure agreements of the Stingray, right, products, where that provides an avenue for challenge for us to start to examine whether or not this is actually a good practice, whether or not this should really overwhelm the rules of forensic analysis or the traditions of evidentiary procedure and collection, to see this stuff used in a more aggressive way, temporarily, obviously, to see that it's challenged and talked about, discussed, and vetted in an open judicial proceeding.
Oh, let's go over here first and then over there.
Hi. I'm Nico from CCDCOE. Thanks for the panel. Actually, I know that most of the talk was about privacy issues, but I haven't heard anything about this ransomware. I mean, now people are struggling most of that with this ransomware viruses and all that encrypt our data. And please don't give me the answer that to keep backup, because the advanced one, now ransomware, they're also encrypt your backup. Right. So you find out after a week or a year.
We did start to touch on that when we were talking about nation-state offensive tools and the need for encryption.
Yes.
Of course, the opposite of that is that a lot of malware is encrypted. In this case, it's not the malware that's encrypted, it's encrypting your data.
Yeah, I would like to have your opinion on that.
I would offer, right, cryptography giveth and cryptography taketh away. Mm-hmm. So as many advantages as it easily provides for us to protect our data, if it's the wrong person that's locking your data up, it's a major challenge. The flip side, though, I think is as simple as something that Matt's alluded to a number of times. Crypto's incredibly hard to get right. And it doesn't necessarily have to be that you screw up the fundamental math, right? I'm a political scientist. I don't know whit about the creation of points on an elliptic curve to what have you, right? But I get that watching people try to implement these algorithms in software, right, they screw up constantly and consistently. And the ransomware is a great example. And this ransomware issue is absolutely a growing challenge, but it's been around for almost 4 years, I would say, in the public eye, right, 4 to 5 years. Companies are still consistently finding ways to decrypt or attack the algorithms and the implementation being used in these tools. That's not to say they're going to be able to do that forever, but there continues to be an imperfect relationship between offensive and defensive efforts here. So I wouldn't say that it's the end of the world. There is still some hope. But we rely on math being hard and software being even harder to continue to save us, I think.
Also, keep a backup. I mean, seriously.
Well, until they go after your backup server as well.
Yeah.
And you're lost there. I think there was a question over here.
Yes, so I heard one of the panelists say that it was a responsibility of government to disclose the zero-day vulnerabilities to protect the internet ecosystem. But then there was a reluctance to say that industry had a responsibility to help law enforcement to protect the human ecosystem. My question is, if adversarial relationship is part of the process, which is kind of what you guys are saying, then wouldn't it be logically more consistent to say that the government is not responsible or required to disclose the zero-day vulnerabilities to industry? It's more logical, isn't it?
I don't think I said that. I think that they ought to be weighing the impact on industry and on consumers against the whatever else the government needs it for. I do think that it would be ideal if the companies and law enforcement and everyone else could work together and come to a solution together in the room, non-adversarial. I think that is not. I think it's unfortunate that that's not the world we live in right now. And as such, some of these discussions are happening in a less than ideal way. I think that it is a shared responsibility rather than an adversarial responsibility to keep everyone safe.
The short answer is, my contention is, the government doesn't own these things, right? Their responsibility is to provide for the general welfare, and as part of that, they shouldn't be keeping information that could potentially harm citizens from them or from companies that can provide for their security. That's the philosophical answer. It creates a ton of complications. The real answer, I think, the more satisfying one is your point is absolutely valid. There's legitimate, talking specifically about the IC here, there's a legitimate collection purpose for the way that these tools are being used, right? That is contributing to the national security and is most likely keeping Americans alive where they might not otherwise. So I would agree with you in that sense, but there must be a rigorous process that validates what the value of that collection is against the potential security threat of non-disclosure. And I think the point that's being made up here in the adversarial process is not to say that one side or the other is right? And my point is saying that there's a fundamental tension here is to say that neither side can win. If either side wins, we lose. I think that's the conclusion here. But it would be unfair and it would be impractical, and I think it would probably be a bad decision to weight the balance too far to one side or the other so as to prevent that continual adversarial relationship, that tension from maintaining. So I think as part of that, a process to decide the value of a vulnerability before it's disclosed, its service to intelligence collection, and the potential cost of replacement, which is something we don't often talk about. It's not necessarily just its use, right? But it's the ability to find a replacement for that asset. So I would grant the point that there is more complexity embedded here, as I think Heather says.
Yeah, I mean, the other thing I think we need to think about, and one of the reasons that I think it has to be a cooperative effort, is the government uses this. The government uses commercial off-the-shelf software. The government uses consumer-side, equipment, hardware, software, everything, and so actually keeping them kind of vulnerable is kind of stabbing yourself in the back.
So I just want to say, like a couple of months ago, we found a vulnerability in a virtual private networking firewall device that just completely undoes all of the cryptographic security, makes it plain text to a smart person.
Are we talking about Juniper?
No,
Oh.
we're not talking about Juniper.
Talking about another.
Oh, no.
We're talking about a different one. And so the only reason I'm bringing this up is the reason we found this. We didn't find this in the code. We found this in a document that had been filed for common criteria certification. We found the bug in that document. And the reason that document existed is because this device had been evaluated for a high-level CCEAL level 4+ usage, which to me, I'm not in the military, but I assume that means it's going to be used at some point, likely for defense purposes. So when you have vulnerabilities in systems like that somebody knows about, it's shooting yourself in the foot, because these systems are probably all over DoD networks. They're probably all over other networks that support the DoD. There's just no way to separate what is a military industry from civilian industry, and when you have problems with one, you have problems with both.
That is a good segue for us to talk about actually Juniper, because then we're not talking about sort of an organic vulnerability that was in the system. Maybe do you want to give a brief overview of what that involves?
Sure.
This happened last December, the discovery of it.
Sure. Okay. So this is like it's almost like this example was sent down, from above to give an example of how scary these things can be. So last December, Juniper Networks, which is a big firewall virtual private networking manufacturer, announced that they had 2 vulnerabilities in their NetScreen firewalls. And the first one was basically a hard-coded password. Somebody had hacked into their networks and added to their source code a hard-coded password, so that when that code was shipped out to devices out in companies and government offices, people could log into this firewall remotely and hack into networks. But the other vulnerability turned out to be an encryption vulnerability. That meant if somebody was making an encrypted connection, like a VPN connection to that device, the crypto would be decryptable. And so the real question for a cryptographer is, how do you do that? How do you make a little change that makes crypto appear to be working and yet breakable? And the long story of this is it turned out that there was I don't want to say backdoor, but I kind of want to say backdoor. There was a vulnerability that was so deliberate before the hackers got there. In Juniper systems, there was a vulnerability based on an NSA-designed random number generator that was so bad that it was really hard to not look at it as though somebody working for Juniper systems, Juniper Networks, had not built that in deliberately, perhaps at the behest of a government. We don't know, but it looked really bad. And what these hackers had done is they'd taken a backdoor that might have been requested by the US government or maybe an allied government, and they had changed the keys to that backdoor to make it so that these hackers could exploit it. And we don't know who these hackers were, but they're not people that we necessarily want exploiting backdoors. So this kind of illustrates that we're not the only people doing this. And when we subvert systems, certainly we're not the only people doing this. When we subvert systems, we're not the only people exploiting our own subverted systems even. So we know this is happening, and we know other people are taking advantage of this, and we just kind of don't know where the limit of it is yet.
Other questions?
Yes, over here. Yeah, Professor Herr, you gave an excellent regulatory description of how a system could work where you still have privacy, but you still have government access for what would be legal access in a proposed thing. But what I understood was you were talking about a regulatory framework within the U.S., and economically, we don't live in just a U.S. market. It's a global market. And the companies that are resisting for economic reasons because they live in a global market, and they have global cost and benefits for any moves like this. And I just ask if you would reflect a little bit, not just from a political science point of view, from an economics point of view.
So I think one of the challenges, and that's the reason, so you hit on a great point, and it's the reason for disambiguating between companies and individuals, because our interests are not the same, and that profit motive has driven. It's ironic that we end up talking about Apple as the arbiter of privacy or Google as a savior of democracy in some ways now, because 5 years ago, when the discussion was about market entry in China, it was a very different set of compromises that were being made, absolutely. And I think it's something that we quickly forget, right? That these are not civil society groups that are masquerading with profit motive. Like, they're fundamentally companies, and that's fine. Right? There's no reason to disabuse ourselves of that notion. So to answer your question first, yes, there is a profit motive. Yes, these companies do exist in a global market. But I think we're beginning to see that security is as much a product as any other feature that they can offer for a variety of reasons and against a variety of different threats. From criminal groups, this ransomware issue that was raised, to state actors and specific targeted intrusion for purposes lawful or otherwise. And so we may actually see that market effect is a positive thing, and we start to see competition over the best security. And it goes to something Matt said, which is my second point. This market is powerful if it's educated, if it has the ability to discern good products and good practices from bad. And one of the challenges with crypto right now is I think we're in a period of hype where just having crypto, I got end-to-end, man, I'm rocking, I'm good. Like, it's not enough to have it. It's more important to know what it is and does or does not do for you. And as the market, as developing countries, as large Western advanced countries are able to start selecting products in this way, I think it moves the market generally in a positive direction, and it allows for this discussion to be about what government is or isn't able to do, as opposed to what privacy we want to keep, what shred of it is left. I think it's a great point, absolutely.
Yeah, and I think, too, it makes more economic sense for companies to be able to have a standardized approach to their product in all markets. I mean, you don't want a Chinese iPhone versus a US iPhone versus a Russian iPhone. I think it helps the companies considerably, both in terms of R&D, regular costs associated with the product, as well as compliance costs, legal and regulatory risk, controlling for all that, to be able to just say, this is our one product, and we're not capable of doing some of the exploitative measures that are being requested of us in certain jurisdictions. So it's one thing to talk about how it should play out in the U.S. jurisdiction, but I think it is important to take in that big picture, not only of the economic realities, but also the legal and regulatory realities that are facing these companies who have to deal with governments around the world.
And a quick tag, sorry, I just realized this struck me. We're all thinking about endpoint vendors right now. We're thinking about Apple and service providers, but there are a suite of global ICT companies that have nothing to do with delivering a product into your pocket. In some ways, their jurisdictional challenges are far more substantial. The level 3s of the world, right, the interconnectors, they have this potential challenge coming down the pipe of intermediary liability, where suddenly they become responsible for looking at code that's coming through their system, potentially to stop ransomware. Right? Why is it that I need to defend my system if I could talk to the ISP up the street and get them to defend the whole block? Right? So I think those challenges are potentially even more stark for non-device manufacturers.
Other questions?
Hi, my name is Chris Bing. I'm a reporter with FedScoop. So I thought the conversation around targeted hacking and mandated backdoors was an interesting one. This obviously stems from a leaked conversation in the Podesta leaks. If this ultimately is a policy initiative that potentially a future Hillary Clinton presidency looks at, I kind of want to just walk down that road. I mean, what would it look like if we have incentives in place for law enforcement to find these vulnerabilities? What does that mean? Obviously, it's going to be hard to purchase them. They're extremely expensive. Does that ultimately mean that we're going to change our workforce? Or I'm just thinking a little bit more about the impact that it's going to cause. Thank you.
So there's a company that everyone likes to talk about because they have some pretty good marketing materials called Zerodium. And Zerodium has printed up this very neat little pricing chart for things that they're looking to buy and sell, modeled on the periodic table of elements. And up at the right-hand corner in the high-value section are exploits for Apple's iOS system. And in the last 3 years, they've tripled the price that they're willing to pay for root access to iOS. Part of this is because iOS is getting more secure. They're doing a better job running it. But part of this is almost certainly because there is increasing demand. So potentially, and this is something that I think we're still struggling with, so a caveat to this, the empirics around how this market functions are incredibly vague. And if you talk to individuals that work in the market and play in the market, they're able to talk about only very narrow sections of it. There's very few people that have any kind of broad-scale understanding. That goes for the academic community as well. So there's been some interesting modeling done. Katie Musouris, who's going to be talking tomorrow, and her group, previously when she was at HackerOne, had done some work called The Wolves of Wall Street that attempted to model a portion of this discovery process that affects this market. But the second point is, more players in the market with a lot of money are going to increase the general cost of these products. That is going to potentially make it more difficult for vendors to then purchase those products and secure their own software, regardless of who owns and discloses them.
Any more questions? I wanted to sort of follow up on something that Sarah had said briefly. When you were talking about, no company wants to be making multiple versions of its product for different jurisdictions. But we had something that, sort of came up in the midst of the Apple FBI thing, and that was, one of the executives for Facebook's WhatsApp in the Americas was arrested over their inability to hand over data simply because they don't retain it. So I sort of understand that impulse from companies to sort of assert this is the only product we're going to make around the world. But does it? I guess I'm wondering about sort of the difficulty that companies are going to face between either they're going to have to pull out of those markets entirely for the safety of their executives, or they are going to have to fall to some kind of pressure overseas in regimes that are simply not going to, undemocratic regimes that simply aren't going to adhere to these assertions of a company like that. What are we facing, or what are companies facing in that regard?
I think you're right. I think companies are thinking on that problem particularly hard right now. And I think that actually the answer may be that you don't put executives in undemocratic countries. That's not a good outcome. But I actually, to pivot just a little bit, one of the reasons that Firefox doesn't have a huge adoption rate in the U.S. It actually, if you look at where our adoption is, it's usually in countries that we don't like very much, non-democratic countries, countries that are oppressive, and that is because they know we're not changing anything. They know they're getting the same Firefox. And I think that's a really interesting dynamic. I think, there's a lot of posturing by governments and some by tech companies too right now around that particular question. What can you ask me to do? I think the Brazil WhatsApp case is a little bit misleading. It was a low-level court that I don't understand how a low-level court has the ability to turn off an internet service, but that's the way it works in Brazil. My lawyers there explained it to me because we were just like, how can this be how it works? So I'm hoping, fingers crossed, this is me speaking as an eternal optimist who is always disappointed. I think that the governments are going to figure it out. I think that the governments have to listen to a little bit of the voice of reason here. And I do think that there's some precedent for pulling out of countries that aren't willing to be reasonable in their policies. On the other hand, I think that it will be interesting the first time a government shuts down. I mean, WhatsApp is incredibly broadly used in Brazil. This was not a widely supported decision. When someone says, I'm going to turn off Facebook, or I'm going to turn off Google, or I'm going to turn off this incredibly broadly used service, or I'm going to make it so all Android phones don't work, there's going to be a popular consequence for that for a politician.
As well as economic consequences.
Yeah, oh, absolutely.
Yeah. So I mean, it's not solely a policy decision here, and I think you do have to take into account the overall utility of the application or the device or whatever software that you're talking about. I mean, for many countries that don't necessarily have an advanced domestic technical sector, I think having access to these kinds of tools is important to prevent, malicious financial crimes online. I mean, having access to these kinds of tools is, in itself, an important thing for governments as well as their constituencies.
Great. Any additional questions? I think we're almost out of time. We might have time for one more, and that's it.
So it'll just be a quick question. We talked about the encrypting the transmission aspect of it, and you mentioned the data part. So what true breakthroughs do you see happening on like cell level security and the ability to actually do that at scale where it makes sense from an economic standpoint?
Sorry, the breaking or the doing it correctly?
Doing it correctly. Because we talked about the transmission part. I think that's, that ship has sailed.
Yep.
We know what's happening in that space.
Yep.
But now data at rest, data in huge databases, the I think the scale of that is immense. Yep. And the cost, the economics around that is also immense. So the real question is, do you think that's going to be solved at some small company's going to figure it out, or do you think a big's going to do it?
So the real challenge there is key management. So you have to make sure that it's very easy to encrypt your data, but then making sure that the right people have access to that data is very hard. And I think the problem with it right now is that, first of all, companies have not really quite made the decision to do it. Because it's a big change in your culture to start saying some people have access to some data and some people don't. But I think it's only going to take a couple more Sony pictures for that to start to make a difference. And I think the really interesting tools that are coming online, not all together online yet, Intel has this new technology called SGX. SGX is basically a trusted part of your Intel processor that runs code in such a way that you can't get into it. Nobody can get into it. Basically, whenever a program is running in Intel SGX, it's just completely isolated from the rest of the system. And so what I think we're going to see, if everything goes well for Intel, is we're going to start to see more and more companies using that technology to basically do this locking down of data in databases. Once you have something you trust in everybody's computer, this whole problem gets enormously easier because you can give them keys, you can distribute keys to everybody, and then you can encrypt everything, and life gets so much easier. But we're a few years away from that being ubiquitous, and who knows, it may fail. But now that it's in processors, I think people are going to start to take advantage of it.
Okay. Great. We're out of time, so please join me in thanking our panelists. Have a great conversation.